Wanted to take the opportunity to let you know about some other events that we will be sponsoring this semester. Next week, any of you who are interested in philosophy of religious studies, please join us in our department. We're going to have a social next Thursday from 3:30 to 5. That's in 407 Cat Hall. Food will be provided. Everyone's welcome. We're also going to be hosting a lecture in November 10th in this very room at this very time. One of our colleagues, Ann Clifford, will be giving a lecture on Pope Francis. So please join us if you're interested. Also, please look out for our course offerings this upcoming spring as well as summer. We'll be offering the Intro to Islam course this spring. We'll be offering the Intro to the New Testament course this spring. And if you have any gen ed requirements to fulfill, we'll be happy to slot you into our Intro to Philosophy or World Religions or Religion in America courses. So now I'd like to introduce another one of my colleagues, Dr. Hector Avalos. He is an expert in biblical studies. He's familiar with Dr. Cargill's work, and he is going to introduce Dr. Cargill properly. Thanks.
Good evening. When I heard that Dr. Cargill was coming to Iowa in 2011, I was very thrilled because I had heard about his work. He is a leader in the digital humanities. He helps to reconstruct ancient sites like Qumran that we'll see tonight. But he's also an archaeologist who digs at Tel Azekah, and if you're interested in digging in Israel, I suggest you speak with him. Are you taking two? So, yeah, so he'll take you there to help dig. But Dr. Cargill started out in 1993 at Fresno State. He is from California, but he reminds us that he's from Central California, which is, he described it as the Iowa of California. So he's very much at home here because he kind of lived in Iowa already, further west. So tonight he's going to tell us how he digitally reconstructed places like Qumran and maybe a little bit of Tel Azekah. And so without further ado, I present to you Dr. Cargill.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Avalos, thank you for the invitation. It's good to be here at Iowa State. I will not make the mistake of mixing up Iowa and Iowa State. I will take questions at the end of the night as long as they're not about a football game that took place earlier this year between Iowa and Iowa State. We won't answer, but anything else you can ask me when we're done. Thank you to the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies for having me tonight. And thank you all for being here. I've been asked to talk tonight about virtual reconstructions of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then a little bit about advances in the field of digital humanities. So what I thought I'd do is we'd look at a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls, a little about the site of Qumran, where the site associated with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then I'll look at how we deal with ancient texts, and then what we can do with ancient archaeological sites, and how we can use the digital humanities to learn about these sites while we excavate them, while we examine them. And then what I do is, instead of just telling you about them, what we also did is we brought the actual machine that creates the digital reconstructions. We haven't flown this. This is the first time we've flown it publicly in 5 years. So we're reconstituting this based in large part on a new excavation we have with the University of Iowa and Tel Aviv University at Tel Azekah, A-Z-E-K-A-H, azekah.org if you're interested. If you are a student or not a student or a senior or just a person who really, really loves archaeology and you are interested in digging at Tel Azekah, especially if you're interested in getting course credit for it, like 6 units of a really nice grade for digging with us at Tel Azekah, please see me afterwards, or you can go to azekah.org, or if you would like university credit, contact me and we can work together with the University of Iowa and have a summer experience, think mid-July through the 3rd week in August. Excavating at a site just west of Jerusalem, and then on the weekends I take you on trips to see holy sites, natural sites, national parks, things like that. If you're interested, please see me after. Let's talk a little bit about Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered beginning in about 1947, and then the discoveries continued to take place after that. And since then, we've discovered about 40,000 fragments from about 800 different manuscripts from the cave surrounding an area, a site known as Qumran. It's on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. And when we discovered, now I didn't do it, but when scholars discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, it changed basically everything we knew about ancient texts, specifically the Hebrew Bible. Okay, no New Testament manuscripts have come out of this. We have every manuscript from the Hebrew Bible, from the Christian Old Testament, except, anybody know? No, no, we don't have Maccabees. We don't have Maccabees. Of the canonical Hebrew Bible text, Esther. Esther is the only one. And scholars have questioned whether or not we actually they had Esther, but we just haven't discovered it, or whether maybe at Qumran Esther wasn't considered canonical, maybe because it's the only book that doesn't mention God. So there's always been questions about the plight of Esther. But when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we basically got 3 different types of documents that we categorized the Dead Sea Scrolls into. One is what we call biblical manuscripts. Just about 40% of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of books that we found in the Hebrew Bible. As I said, everything except Esther. Okay? Then we found another, about 30% of the documents that we have are what we refer to as Second Temple literature. These are documents that we've known about, that we know about, but that didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible, into the canon. These are books that maybe you've heard of them. Enoch, Jubilees, Tobit, the Wisdom of Ben Sira, and non-canonical Psalms. One of my favorites is Psalm 151. How many of you knew there was a 151st Psalm? They have many other Psalms at Qumran. But these were texts that we knew about, and they happened to be found at Qumran. But the thing that really caused a lot of excitement for many scholars was what we referred to as the sectarian documents. And these are documents that we'd never seen before. So in with all these biblical manuscripts and what we would consider today extra-canonical manuscripts, we actually have sectarian literature. And a lot of the literature appears to describe a group of Jews that didn't necessarily subscribe to, if we can use the word orthodoxy or the theology, that was being followed at, let's say, the Jerusalem temple. This was a different understanding. It was still very Jewish, but it was a different sect of Judaism that followed a different calendar. And that calendar happens to be consistent with the calendar that we find in, say, for instance, Jubilees or Enoch or things like that. Okay? And they used code, very sectarian terminology, to talk about their little group versus external groups. And this is both Gentiles, other groups that they didn't like, and Jews that didn't agree with them. So it's very much sectarian literature. And maybe you've heard of some of these documents. The Damascus document, which actually is a document that we had heard about, but it's so congruent with the sectarian literature. In fact, many scholars have argued that what we find in the sectarian manuscripts from Qumran might be a subset or a subgroup of the group that would have subscribed to the Damascus document. The Damascus document was discovered in Cairo, Geniza, old manuscript repository in a Geniza, a place that you put old retired documents in Cairo. So we've known about that one, but we also found things like the community rule, or Thanksgiving hymns, or a Sabbath liturgy, or the War Scroll, and then one of the most fascinating set of documents, Pesherim, or Pesher scrolls. Peshers are interlinear commentaries on prophetic texts. So in Cave 1 we had 1Q Pesher Habakkuk. So they basically take a verse from the prophet Habakkuk. Anybody familiar with the book Habakkuk? It's in your Bible. It's one of those ones you skip in the Old Testament. Very few people read it. But they would take a verse there, and then they would say, Pesher, right? This verse means, and then they would reinterpret that verse to apply to them and to their community. So we have all these different scrolls that we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It has launched an entire subfield of biblical studies over the past, 60-something now years. And this is one of the fields of studies that I and Dr. Avalos and many others are engaged in, a study of this literature, not just because it gives us a look at another sectarian Jewish community besides the Pharisees, Sadducees, and of course the Christians, which is a Jewish sectarian movement. Not just because it gives us another look into what another Jewish sect would look like, but how they interpreted Scripture. How they looked at Scripture and how they interpreted it. In addition to the fact that not all of the biblical manuscripts that we have from Qumran match the text that you have in your Hebrew Bibles today. In fact, Qumran had copies of, for instance, the Isaiah scroll of the book of Isaiah. Most people have heard of the prophet Isaiah. They had different copies of the prophet Isaiah that actually differed from word to word. Now, most of the words were the same, but every once in a while you come across a word that was different. And this fascinates scholars, because then you have to ask the question, well, which one is correct? And then we begin that debate. So the Dead Sea Scrolls basically changed biblical studies in the late 40s, and we've been arguing about them ever since. Now, where were they discovered? They were discovered in a series of 11 caves in and around a site called Qumran, Khirbet Qumran. This is the famous Cave 4. If you've ever seen a picture of cave of Qumran, this is the one that you typically see, because more manuscripts came out of this cave than any other. Where is Qumran? Well, it's on Earth. It's in the eastern Mediterranean, and as we drill down here, you can see you've got Italy, Greece, Turkey, Anatolia. You've got Egypt to the south, and then you've got over there by Jerusalem. And just east of Jerusalem, if you flip it upside down, you can actually come over and see, if I can get my cursor here. We're actually looking towards the south from a satellite image. You've got the Dead Sea here. You've got the Sea of Galilee here. The Jordan River connecting the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. The word Yarden, the word Jordan, actually means to go down. Why? Because one of the highest mountains in the region is just north. The snow melt at Mount Hermon melts and becomes the Sea of Galilee, and then it goes down to the lowest point on the face of the earth, the Dead Sea. The lowest point on the face of the earth, about a little over 400 meters below sea level. Okay, the lowest place on the earth in the United States is Death Valley in California, 52 feet below sea level. This is 1,200 feet, basically, below sea level. You are the last generation to see the Dead Sea. It'll be gone in 40 years, unless something is done to refill it. Why? Because of all the water runoff into the Galilee and then into the West Bank. There's just less and less water getting into the Dead Sea, and it's shrinking from the south up. It's shrinking in on the sides. Has anybody ever been in the Dead Sea? Right? You can't sink in there. It actually tries to push you out. You can do the Iron Cross. You can smoke your pipe. You can lay on your back and read a book. We took baseball mitts in there once and played catch. You don't have to egg beat her or anything. It just holds you up. So it's very buoyant. And Qumran is actually on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Okay? So here's what it looks like in the picture. Here's what it is. Here's what it is on the map. And the Dead Sea Scrolls date from anywhere, depending on who you ask, from the late 3rd century BCE to the 1st century CE. Okay, we have one scroll that we think is dated a little after that, the Copper Scroll, which we can argue whether it should belong in this corpus, but we'll save that for another time. You can see how much the Dead Sea has evaporated, has receded from the shore there. Again, the lowest point on the face of the earth, the southern end of it, by the way, if you like to do those salt mud baths with the cucumbers on your eyes and lay on the beach in the sun, and you want to go to the Dead Sea, there's a huge industry. A lot of the stuff that you would buy in the mall is actually lotions taken from the salts from the Dead Sea. It's a huge industry there. And we're looking at the terrain around Qumran. And it looks like this. This is Khirbet Qumran, or at least what's left of it. Okay? So here in the foreground, you can see some of the nearer caves, caves 4, 5, 6. Believe it or not, down on the far side there, you've got 7, 8, 9, some other caves that are more eroded. And then, of course, if we look at an aerial shot, you can actually see, this is the desert, right? This is the wilderness. And you can actually see some of the site here. You can see a tower structure, a bunch of rocks. Depends on how early in the dig season we actually go visit Qumran. If it's early, people say, wow, this is fascinating. And if it's late in the season, people go, great, more rocks. This is awesome, right? Because you've got all these rocks. Very treacherous. And, of course, Israel has done us a favor of putting a nice restaurant and a gift shop. It's like Disneyland, right? Everything, you pay your admission, and you come out into a restaurant and a gift shop, right? Where you buy ice cream, like mad, glida, right? Because it's hot out here. This is what it looks like from an aerial view. You can see what's left of the Dead Sea off in the distance. And this is Qumran from the west, right? Now, if you're like me, the first time I saw this, I went, okay, great, there was something there, and they made it out of rocks. But I'm not an archaeologist, and I don't really know what that is supposed to be. I see rocks, and the interpreter there will walk you around and say, and this is where this was, and this is where this was. But we don't really know what it is. For now, what we want to know about the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran is that when the Dead Sea Scrolls began to be discovered in 1947, people just flocked to the hills and started looking in every cave possible for more fragments. And as they began to look for it, they began to say, is there a site in the middle of this? And they found Khirbet Qumran. They had known about Khirbet Qumran long before, and they began to excavate the site that's near Cave 4. And they immediately came up with a theory called the Qumran-Essene hypothesis, which was, who could have built this place? Well, the Essenes. They're mentioned by Philo and Josephus and others. They're said to be predeterminists, which matches what some of the sectarian stuff that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so based upon a lot of the contents of the scrolls, and then the excavations at Khirbet Qumran, there was developed a theory called the Qumran-Essene hypothesis, which is very basically states that the Essenes built Qumran, and then they wrote or they are responsible for the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the Qumran-Essene hypothesis. And while that hypothesis was challenged early on by a few people, that became the dominant theory at Qumran, the Qumran-Essene hypothesis. And then that theory began to be challenged time and again over time until the point where we are today, where it's still not an even split. I'd say the Qumran-Essene hypothesis in modified forms is still the dominant hypothesis, but there are many scholars today who would argue that the Dead Sea Scrolls have absolutely nothing to do with the site of Qumran, that they were actually put there by people fleeing from Jerusalem or some other groups that were just trying to hide. They stashed the scrolls into caves as they were heading, say, for instance, down south to Masada. So there are some who say the scrolls have nothing to do. They divorced the scrolls from the site, and they say, then what was the site? It could have been a pottery production facility. The late and my friend Yuval Peleg argued this very recently in a book. He was actually killed earlier this year looking at another cave that collapsed on him. And so may he rest in peace. He was a friend of mine, and I miss him. But his theory was that this was a pottery production facility. It had nothing to do with the scrolls. And other scholars have said that this was a villa rustica, that this was a site where a wealthy family in Jerusalem had a country estate. So in the winter, when it got a little cold up in the hills, they could come out to the Dead Sea, and or it was a farm, or it was a trading post, or something other than a sectarian group of religious Jews writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this is the debate today. This is the state of the debate. Do we consider the Dead Sea Scrolls to be part of the context of Qumran? And if so, what can we say about the site? And if we don't consider those scrolls to be part of that site, what can we say about the site? And you can go online and you could read all kinds of articles and lawsuits of people yelling at each other and screaming at each other about how to interpret a bunch of holes in the ground. And I'll leave that for another lecture. Okay? What I want to point out is that traditionally we have a site. We have scrolls discovered in some caves around that site, and we have jars discovered in the caves that have the same chemical composition and shape as jars found on the site. And that's an important link for those who want to associate the Dead Sea Scrolls with the site of Qumran, because those who don't make that association like to point out that not a single shred of a single fragment of any, that's how they say it, not a single fragment of a single scroll of a Dead Sea Scroll has ever been found in the site inside the walls of Qumran. Okay, so they say, that's how you know. Which I would say, I would argue, well, of course not. It burned to the ground. Any scroll that would have been in the walls should have burned. whereas when they're off in the caves and stored away, they might be able to, survive a fire and 2,000 years. Right? Of course, once you start discovering things in 1947, and as I'll show you in a minute, they begin to deteriorate. And so the question then turns to, while we continue the debate about what was the nature of the site at Qumran, and what is the nature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, basically who wrote these documents, who's responsible for them, one group, multiple groups, right? There's evidence that can support both of these arguments. We want to focus the rest of this lecture tonight on what are we doing to preserve both the documents and the sites. Okay? If you come dig with us at Tel Azekah, I'll take you to the Shrine of the Book. This is on the campus of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And if you go there, and you'll meet Cale here on the left. You'll meet him here in a second, my graduate student, Cale Staley. He's largely responsible for the new project that we're working on. And so you'll meet him in a minute. But if you go to the Shrine of the Book, you can do, if you wanted, what you're not supposed to do, and that is take a picture inside the Shrine of the Book, which I did of my students here. And they're looking at the Great Isaiah Scroll. Except it's not the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's actually a facsimile. It's a copy of the Great Isaiah Scroll, which they've now designated as this is a copy of the Great Isaiah Scroll, because once they put the Great Isaiah Scroll around this large dowel, presentation case, in the center of this round building, it began to deteriorate. So they're trying to show it, and it began to deteriorate. So they finally took it down, and now you get to see a very nice facsimile, a copy. And those of you who can read Hebrew can walk around and read the text of Isaiah as it was preserved 2,000 years ago. And why is that for many people, if I can use the term a religious moment or a very inspirational moment? It's because you're now reading the oldest text of a copy of any book of the Bible by over 1,000 years. When we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest actual copy of a book from the Hebrew Bible that we had dated to about the 11th century AD, 11th century CE. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, we now had original manuscripts of books of the Bible that were 1,000 years older than the oldest thing that we had. You're actually looking at a copy of the book of Isaiah from maybe the first, maybe the second, but the first century BC. So for those of you who like to walk in the footsteps of history, you can go to the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem and actually see these scrolls. The problem is this is a copy. And now, in 2010, I was fortunate enough to host a documentary for National Geographic called Writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. And yes, they made me dress up to look as much as I could like Indy. I refused to wear a fedora, so I got this Australian hat, but they made me run around on the rocks, and then I went around and I interviewed different scroll scholars. For the purposes of the show, acted like I knew very little, and I was just on a quest to discover what different people had to say about the Dead Sea Scrolls. But one of the nice things about doing this, and I thought it turned out very nice, I'm very pleased with it, you can still find it on Nat Geo. One of the nice things about it is it gave me behind-the-scenes access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of the joys of my life was going into the vault of the Shrine of the Book. If you've ever seen the old Get Smart or the new Get Smart, if you remember the opening scene and the closing scene of the show Get Smart, he goes into the door, they open it, they close it, he goes into another door, they lock it, open it, lock it. You go through like 5 vaulted doors, one of them blast-proof, you know. And by the time you get in there, you have this glorified wine cellar that's just temperature-controlled and light-controlled for manuscripts. And the company that I was working with, CTVC, out of the UK, was able to get us, me with Adolfo Reutmann, the curator of the Shrine of the Book, to pull out the actual Isaiah scroll, the Great Isaiah scroll, and set it on the table. And we don't touch it, at least we're not supposed to. I did almost knock it on the ground. It's mounted on a board, and I didn't know that the lip of the board was hanging over the chair, so this obviously didn't make it into the documentary. But I leaned on it, and the whole thing came up, and I just looked at Adolfo, and he goes, 2,000 years. 2,000 years, you wreck it, you know, for TV. Great. Reality TV, great. So that didn't make the cut. But what does make the cut is Adolfo Reutmann reading from the Isaiah scroll and me looking on there, and you can actually see one of the cameramen. So one of the joys of my life in doing this kind of research is actually going in deep down under the Shrine of the Book to actually see the real Isaiah scroll, the one that you see a copy of. This is what it looks like. I got to take a picture of it. And you can see it's very well written on lines, on multiple pieces of parchment. You can actually see what they would do is they'd sew them together, so you can actually create a scroll. So when you read in the New Testament, for instance, early in the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus went in and he began to read from the scroll, this is what you can imagine, because he reads from the scroll of Isaiah. He goes in and he finds a place and he begins to read from the scroll. This is a copy that dates to about that time. They weren't always as well preserved. They weren't always behind 5 blast doors and temperature-controlled rooms. If you look very carefully at the picture of John Strugnell, and by the way, these guys are geniuses. They knew the Bible inside and out. They knew what it was supposed to say. They knew paleography. They knew how to take, I always say that studying the Dead Sea Scrolls is like putting together a puzzle without all the pieces and without the picture on the top of the box. Right? And you're trying to piece this thing together, sometimes with one bit of one letter on one fragment. You're trying to put together a puzzle. These guys are trying to put this together, but if you notice very carefully, he's got a cigarette right here, and he's just ashing on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Same with Joseph Millick over here. Just, we got to smoke, and I've got to do my research, so why not do them together? So they weren't always as well cared for. In fact, Penina Shore, one of my colleagues that works in the Shrine of the Book and for the Israel Antiquities Authority, one of her jobs and her team of highly skilled lab technicians and curators is to go through to take off the sellotape, the transparent tape that was used to hold these together. That's how they did it. They took this tape, like Scotch tape, and they put it upside down, and then they would just stick the scrolls on there. Oh, pick it up, put it down, and then we wonder why they're in the shape they are. This team is going through and bit by bit, under microscopes, taking off that tape, restoring the scroll, and then sewing it between 2 transparent, basically pieces of nylon. And then they sew so that nothing touches it except these, and then they put those on display. So they're doing a remarkable work there, and we'll look at some of the other work they're doing, but it wasn't always cared for. Here's the famous picture of Solomon Schechter in Cambridge with the Cairo-Geniza manuscripts, and they're just lumped into tea crates. Right? So this was, when we were discovering these fragments, how we used to care for them. Okay? So what do? The Dead Sea Scrolls were basically off limits to anybody but the scholars and the grad students associated with those scholars who were assigned to study the scrolls. That was until the early 90s, when people just kept demanding, hey, what's going on with the Dead Sea Scrolls? How come you're not publishing them quickly enough? Why is it taking so long? And so to satisfy the scholarly inquiry, they began to release photographs, digital photographs. This is the early days of digital photography of these fragments. And they released them, but in isolation. And so the Huntington Library got together and used an incredibly sophisticated machine to process all these photographs. And it's one of these, a Mac Classic. Does anybody remember this? These are now aquariums in novelty stores, right? This was my first computer. I had an Apple IIc, but this is my first Mac, right? And they used one of these to basically piece together all of these pictures of the scrolls and then published, with some question and some lawsuit, a copy of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which then again really urged the scholars behind it to start really publishing the Dead Sea Scrolls. And now today, now that the scrolls are published and publicly available, the research is turning to photographing them at a high resolution, and then with different angles of light, which actually allow you to see areas of the scroll and to read the scroll even where the ink is completely faded from eyesight. So you can use things like infrared. So one of my colleagues, Bruce Zuckerman at USC, has been doing this for many years, just getting together and shooting the pictures of these Dead Sea Scrolls. And what you end up with is something like this. You can actually see all of the different textures of the actual scrolls. And in places where the ink has evaporated, you can actually see the indentations of where the scribe's pen had pressed and where that ink had been, how it had changed the chemical makeup of the fragment. So we can actually read scrolls where the ink is gone. They're doing other things like where there's a hole in the scroll, they'll mathematically calculate the back side of the scroll that it would have been pressed up against. And then they're reading the back of that scroll, flipping it, inverting it, and then filling in the blanks for what the scroll might have said. Many people are working. King's College in London has a Dead Sea Scrolls digitization project. The National Institute of Nuclear Physics in Italy is doing some chemical analysis of some of the scrolls. And of course, now the Israel Antiquities Authority has a beautiful, beautiful new project. You can see video on YouTube. Just go to Israel Antiquities Authority Dead Sea Scrolls. And they have now published websites with their new pictures of the scrolls, which not only have complete photographs of these scrolls that used to be notorious for not being available, but you can drill down and you can actually, they've actually tagged these scrolls so that as your mouse hovers over different verses, even if you can't read Hebrew, you can see chapter 2, verse 4. Right? You can see chapter 2, verse 5. And you can actually read along in the Hebrew of the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible that we have. You can see the details. You can see how good this scribal hand was. You can get really close to these things. And look at them, and you can see this 2,000-year-old copy of the Bible. And then companies like one of my favorite companies, Accordance Bible Software, have taken these scrolls, transcribed them digitally, and then tagged them morphologically. So you can just hover over a word, and you can see what that word means. You can see if that word is used elsewhere in scrolls. So we have come leaps and bounds to digitizing these texts. But what about the archaeology? How do you represent archaeological data? How do you take this stuff and represent it in a computer? Well, let's look, for instance, at Tel Azekah. So if you want to come dig, if you're in Iowa and you want to come dig in Israel, you can come to Tel Azekah. This is an aerial picture of the top of the Tel. And you can see some of the squares we're beginning to excavate. And usually in publications, it's very standard to have a photograph like this. This is actually a photograph that we published. Here's what we excavated this year. Here's another photograph. You can see the size of the site compared to the folks there. We're getting down closer to my area that I dig in area S2. So maybe you've seen photographs, or traditionally you've seen this, right? Tell me about Azekah. Well, here you go. Here's where we dig. Here are our squares, right? And if you're a really good archaeologist, you might be able to say, oh, look, here's what we've got. You can see the balks in the center. You can see a wall coming up here in the upper left. Great, how fascinating. Could you imagine walking into a classroom and trying to teach students archaeology? Look what a beautiful site Qumran is. Okay? Here, I'll be more detailed. Right? Now, if you're a trained archaeologist, this is great. But if you're not, this doesn't do much for you. So what we've tried to devise is a data management system that actually trains archaeologists to do what I'm going to show you here in a second, and then integrates this modeling process into the actual research process. So modeling the material actually becomes part of the archaeological process. And using a single model, you can actually document, digitize, and visualize all the things that you find, the extant terrain, plus all of the discoveries, including fixed objects like walls, cisterns, things like that, as well as objects, pottery, coins. You can actually take photographs of them, texture those onto digital models, and then georeference those into a virtual reconstruction of the site. You can then take that same site, that same model, and raise up a proposed reconstruction of the site, and then fly around it. Okay, creating 3D virtual reality models. You don't have to get on a plane to go to Israel to fly around ancient Qumran. And we call this the Matryoshka doll. You know what these are, the Russian dolls? So you're actually stacking a model of a coin in a model of a square, in a model of an area. And one model, just stacked, possesses all of the extant data and all of the proposed reconstruction. So we can take Tel Azekah, which is in a beautiful part of the country, and we can capture it digitally. And then we can take that, the things that we find in the digital reconstructions of the squares, and stick it into the model. And we can take all the things we find and locate that in the digital square. We can then take these objects that we find and upload them to a publicly available database so that other archaeologists at other sites can search, hey, is there anything else that matches this description? Okay? We used to represent sites like this, a photograph, or some people would make isometric drawings of them. Sometimes they get better and better. So what we tried to do is create a computer model that shows you what the site would have looked like, allows us to make changes to the model if we change our theory or make a new discovery, and then allows us to test reconstructions. Many times on archaeological sites there are questions as to how something ought to be reconstructed. We can actually do both and test them and let other scholars see them. So the model not only illustrates, but it tests existing theories and informs new archaeological theories. And we do that by scanning in the top plan, then drawing, and this was my graduate research, drawing every single rock that you find in the ground into virtual reality, then beginning to connect them via proposed lines. One of the nice things that you can do in virtual reality is go underground. You can't do this, believe it or not, in real life. Go underground and look underneath at the underside of it. We then begin to texture the site. Then we add all the horizontal elements, and the result is a 3D virtual reality, fully textured, photorealistic reconstruction of that pile of rocks that you saw at the beginning of the slideshow. We can do water surfaces. We can do all different kinds of textures. We can show you all of the different aspects of the site, from meeting rooms to plastered areas to reconstructing flour mills. You put the flour on the top, you get an animal or a poor guy who's in trouble, he grinds the stone, the flour comes out at the bottom. In the meantime, you've got water flowing by that you can use then to make bread. And you can make it as photorealistic as you can get photographs and textures of the site. And so if you remember early on, here's a kiln for making the pottery. You can also reproduce all the pots that were discovered at Qumran. You can reproduce the areas that they used to raise animals. And then, of course, the famed scriptorium that's at the center of the attraction. The reason that this room was associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they found 2 inkwells. And at the time of its discovery, it was the only site with 2 inkwells discovered from the same locus. So they said, writing must be done here. In fact, even scholars who think that the Dead Sea Scrolls have nothing to do with the site of Qumran concede that writing, some kind of writing, they found inkwells here, some kind of writing was done in this room. So we propose reconstructing these plastered elements as kind of a bench. Maybe this is where the parchment would have gone, and they could have written the scrolls there. And of course, at the end of the day, if this will load here, we can then take this model and fly it. I can take the research, I can then edit it, I can fly a camera through this, I can edit it, overdub it, and we can actually create movies that can be used in classrooms or in museums or just posted online or used in an undergraduate lecture classroom to say, when you look at those rocks on the ground, here's what you should be seeing, right? You should be seeing a mikveh, a Jewish ritual bath near one of the entrances. You would go in impure, you would come out ritually purified for going about whatever worship or study you happen to be doing. You can see the water system coming in like Star Wars. You can go to see the old Iron Age cistern. You can actually just tour the site, right? And you can use this technology not only to compile research, but also to give something to students or those who aren't specially trained in archaeology to at least experience what it was like to walk around this ancient site. Right? So this is Khirbet Qumran. Now, what I'd like to do is have Cale come up, and I want to actually show you what the virtual reality site looks like, and then I want to show you the database, the back end of what he does to build this, and then we can take questions from there. So I'm going to have you do that there. I will kill this. And while Cale's setting up here, we use, just to head off this question, we use a piece of software called Presages Creator. Right? It's not a Messiah complex, trust me, but it's called Presages Creator to create this model. And then we use another Presages piece of software called Vega Prime to actually fly it. So what Cale's going to do, and you'll see a few anomalies like trees floating in the middle of, it's not the rapture, trust me, it's just a tree that's out of place, and I didn't have time to fix it before we got here. But I'll let Cale fly you through here. So what you can do in virtual reality that you can't do in, say, Maya or 3D Studio Max or things like that is you can actually go wherever you want. In fact, I was approached once when I was at UCLA by the makers of a game called Assassin's Creed. Is anybody familiar with this game? They said, is it possible to put Romans in that? And I said, depends. How much do you have? And they wanted us to give it to them so they could put Romans in it. Needless to say, there are no Romans running around here. You will see some birds, some ibexes. By the way, I hope you're not motion sick. This thing is incredibly hard to steer. I'm trying to ask them for a Nintendo that I can go a little faster, but it's basically a flight simulator. But what you can do is you can go anywhere in the site. And so what Cale and I are in the process of doing now, this is Jesus mode. You can walk right through walls. It's great. You just come right up. So you have ladders. So what you can do is you can experience the site as if you were at the site. You can actually go up ladders and into rooms and down into one of the things we used to do is go down into the mikveh. I'm unrighteous. I go down, I get in. Now I'm purified. Now I can go worship, or now I can go pray, things like that. So this is what we mean by virtual reality. You can reconstruct this up into 3D, and then you can walk around and experience it. What we need is a 7-year-old to drive this thing, because they're really good at the video games. Do we have 7-year-olds? No? Not tonight? Okay. We're a Delta flight. What are we doing?
Oh, I got it upside down.
Okay. All right. So what we'll do is, instead of looking in virtual reality, there we are. Oh, there we go. So now we're the space shuttle. It is rapture mode. Look at this. Up, up, up. So this is what we mean. This works in a classroom, right? We can actually go into a classroom and say, let's see why people argue that this was a sectarian Jewish community. Or let's see why it's not a sectarian Jewish community, using the archaeology that was published on paper with those circular rocks that you saw. Now, the last thing we want to close with is, we can close that out, I actually want to show you the database and the new project we're working on at Tel Azekah. Once again, same idea. We take the printed map of the site, and we scan it onto a polygon in virtual reality. Then once we make sure that that is the right distance, a meter is actually a meter, we can actually reconstruct the site based on that. Cale will eliminate that, and you can actually see the site that he's been working on for the past year. You can actually see the different areas at Tel Azekah. This is an active archaeological excavation in Israel between the University of Iowa, Heidelberg University, and Tel Aviv University, to name some others. There are some other universities digging there. And if you would like to come dig in this site, there is much fun to be had. There is much hard work to be done. I often say that you can lose some weight, get a nice tan, and get really fit while getting course credit and seeing the Holy Land, which is what we do. You also meet some friends that will last you a lifetime. We counted last year 15 different languages spoken on the site at any one time. I had them all sing Happy Birthday to my son on camera once, so there's a nice video online somewhere of 15 languages singing Happy Birthday to little Mac. This is area S2. This is S2. This is area S2 down here below, and if we slow the zoom down, you can actually get in really close. I spent 9 weeks of my life in a cistern right down there in the ground. So if you're on my Facebook, or if you're on the website where we keep all the Azekah pictures, you can actually see the actual photographs as I excavate this site down to the ground. And then this is the digital reconstruction of the site based upon the total station measurements that we take on site. So this is as close as you can get to real-time reporting of the archaeological excavation while we excavate it, and then what we found. We can take the objects we find, model them, and stick them into the site. Any questions? Thank you, Cale, for doing this. Any questions? Yes, please. Ah, yes, goodness gracious. What I want to do is go borrow somebody's 3D printer, print out all the parts for a 3D printer, and then build a 3D printer with the parts from the 3D printer. It cost me about $50. 3D printing is the next big game, right? This is the next big thing. Wouldn't it be great to actually put in take the digital model of a piece of pottery, a vessel, idol? We found plaques with fertility goddesses doing odd things to themselves. We found this. There's this very popular, it's in a different PowerPoint. There's a very popular fertility goddess pose of a woman with an incredibly distressed face holding twins, just going. She's holding a twin in each arm. And I just had twins last year, so I know this face that women make when they're holding both their twins and like, oh, just shoot me now, right? Because they're both screaming. We actually have that plaque. Wouldn't it be neat to be able to model that plaque and then do a 3D print of that and then pass that around? Here's what it would have been like if you worshipped this particular fertility goddess. Maybe you would have worn this around your neck. I can see gift shop. I can see all kinds of online sales, eBay, and things like that. But 3D printing is something that we're looking into.
We do have a microphone for questions.
Ah, sure.
And I just wanted to say before we get into more, I neglected to thank a couple of our sponsors, Iowa State University's Atheist and Agnostic Society, as well as Iowa State University's Philosophy Club. So thank you very much for co-sponsoring our event tonight. Here you go.
And we can turn this into an AMA, right, for the Reddit users, and ask me anything. You can just fire away and...
I'm worried about the possibility that theories may be set in concrete, because although you're drawing, you're not just showing images, you're showing conclusions in these 3D things. And therefore, once someone has seen a picture, they're going to assume that that is the way it is. Is that...
That's correct.
Been
yeah,
an
that's
issue
an
with,
absolute
especially with students?
I've received that criticism since I started to get into this work. The idea, and again, if I may, and tell me if I'm not accurately paraphrasing this question. That is, when you do a digital reconstruction, one of the fears is that the reconstruction that I propose is like any other reconstruction on paper, and that is, there was one a colleague of mine, but one of the top scholars in our field, who says you shouldn't show people that reconstruction because people will think that's what it actually looked like. To which I said, good, right? This is my reconstruction. But her point was valid. The scholar's point was valid. To which I said, this is why we can do this. That's supposed to be more dramatic. How about I go here and just do it this way? What we can do at any point is we can show the undergirding wireframe. We can show the original map. And we can ask the question, do you dispute this map? See, the question is always in a reconstruction. You can cheat. You can make it look like anything you want. And you can say, well, I based this reconstruction on this model, on this evidence. To which a good archaeologist, a responsible archaeologist, should argue, how did you get from there to here? Show your work, right? You've all heard this in class. Show your work. So what I do is I show my work. You saw the original map sitting there. Here's the wireframe that we drew from the map. And then I take it a step further and I can say, this is disputed, namely by you, Professor so-and-so. And I can say, your understanding of this site, let's say 4 points on the ground. Right? How can the analogy I use in my book is, if you have 4 points forming a square on the ground, how can you reconstruct that? Well, one is to bring those 4 points straight up and you have a cube. And you go, that's how it looked. But you can also take those 4 points to one point in the center and make a pyramid. And you can say, no, that's how it looked. What we can do in the digital software, we don't have time for it tonight, but what we can do in the software is reconstruct both. And we can even name them after the scholars. We can go through the literature and say, so-and scholar X says this, scholar Y says this, scholar Z says this, here's X, here's Y, here's Z. We can actually preserve all three of those reconstructions and then look at the surrounding environment and say, is there any reason why we should say this one is better than another? And sometimes we can't, so I leave them both. We use the same, they're called switches, data switches. We use the same data switches to show different time periods. So we can say, here's how it was reconstructed in the 1st century BC, but then they added on to it, right? They put in a pool, right? They put on a new 3-season deck, and here's what it looked like 100 years later. And so we can just toggle between the 1st century AD and the 1st century BC in the same way that we can toggle between Professor X reconstruction and Professor Y's. What's important is transparency. Literally, transparency. There it is, right? You can actually see the original map, which that scholar usually doesn't dispute. You can see how we faithfully modeled that map. And then the question is, how does one reconstruct a hole in the wall? Was it a window? Was it a door? How do we reconstruct this room? Was it a dining room? Was it an assembly hall? Was it a place where you had animals? Right? So while I may not be able to answer the question, and while I will certainly propose what I think is the truth, or what is the proper interpretation, truth is a philosophical term, what we do is preserve in very real terms, the transparency of the original data, and then we try to demonstrate all possible different reconstructions. And if somebody comes to me and says, I don't think it was that, I think it was this, we'll actually model it in that way and say, here's why we think it's not that. This beam is too long. It can't support that weight. Or we actually don't like this because right next to it we have something very similar, and it's obviously reconstructed this way, so we reconstructed that same doing this. So the question of transparency, and this goes for any form of modeling, is when you offer a reconstruction, you are making a value judgment based upon evidence. And so how best to demonstrate that I'm trying to be faithful to the evidence, you actually preserve the original work, and you go ahead and model the alternatives.
Any other questions?
Please.
On your modeling, are you also including the stone artifacts and tools and pottery, or are those too insignificant?
No.
Or already previously
everything
classified?
we possibly can. So stone, pottery, metal, glass, anything that we find. Now, there comes a point when you say, yeah, this shard, we're not going to model it. We are going to use it for dating. If it's a significant pot or something, we'll actually make a note of it. If it's something really nice, we'll reconstruct it. But the rest of it is just standard archaeological procedure. But we do like to take significant finds and model them separately as separate models, and then georeference those models, like the Russian doll, into this model so that you've got a full database of whatever you found. We can then tag them, by the way, with the date switches. If we know that this is an Iron II C, an Iron II or a late bronze pot, we can actually tag it as such, and then we can hit a switch and light up all the late bronze stuff that we found. And that usually helps us determine a different stratum in the site. So that is something that we're doing, yeah.
Anyone else?
You kind of danced around a little bit with the Qumran Essene hypothesis.
I did.
Would you be willing to share your personal conclusions on that?
I will, yes. The last slide in my PowerPoint is a book I wrote called Qumran Through Real Time. Get it? Get it? Get it? Get it? Qumran Through Real Time. And it's a virtual reconstruction of Qumran. And in it, I go through every hypothesis that's been argued about the Dead Sea Scrolls, starting at the Qumran Essene hypothesis and going through all the alternatives that have been offered. What I argue in my book, this is my theory, is that Qumran was originally established as a Hasmonean fortress. This is not a new theory. This theory has been around prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There have been, and I document this in my book, there are several scholars, explorers, who knew about Qumran, visited Qumran, and said quite definitively, this is a defensive structure, this is a fortress. So there have been many scholars, even prior to the discovery of the scrolls, who said this is a fortress. Once the scrolls were discovered, all of the focus went to, no, this is a sectarian center, this is a religious site. And many of those who argue that the scrolls are either written by whomever, and I also don't call them Essenes. I think the Essenes are the best candidates, but I always call them the Qumran sectarians, or the Qumranites, or the Jewish community that lived at Qumran. And I deliberately do that. I don't call them Essenes. They're really good candidates, but they may not be Essenes. I mean, that's just where I am on that. It's definitely Jewish. I think there was a sectarian group of Jews that reoccupied the site based upon the fact that the site was originally built as a very poorly built Hasmonean fortress. As the Hasmoneans spread to the south, as they expanded, the Hasmoneans were notorious for this. They expanded the borders of their kingdom, and as they continued to push to new frontiers, especially down towards the Nabateans, they would build a new fort. You can see a line of fortresses from Doak near Jericho to Qumran, up into the Bukeya, to Hyrcania, back down the shore of the Dead Sea. You can see these fortresses pushing south. I think they just abandoned the site. Somebody else came in and resettled the site, and based upon the expansions to the site, we can say that it's a communal, non-military group. Whoever it was a community, Now, what size? I don't think it was 200 people, like has been, I think 60, 70, 50 maybe people living there. I don't think there was as many as people have argued in the past. And it was non-military. They were punching holes in walls. They were punching holes in walls, which is never a good thing if you're trying to have a defensive site. They were expanding the areas. The low wall. Some of these walls probably wouldn't keep. Maybe they were boundaries, like like a fence that just says, "Hey, this is us and this is you." I think whoever moved into that site wasn't interested in. They weren't treating it as a fort. They were treating it as some kind of center. The question is, who were those people, and how many of the scrolls are they responsible for? I do think that there's some validity to the arguments that have been made, but Steve Fawn is one of them in Israel, that says that there is some correlation between the distance from the caves at Qumran and the nature of the material coming out of them. Dr. Fawn wrote an article called "What if we had discovered Cave 11 first? Would we think there are scenes?" It's a good thesis. What I will say is there have been other theories that say these documents have nothing to do with Qumran. They actually come from the temple library, which doesn't make a lot of sense because most of the documents are very anti-temple Judaism. So why would they be keeping documents that are against them? Others have argued that this is actually various libraries throughout Jerusalem that all just happened to end up in the backyard of this site in a hidden cave that nobody's supposed to know about. The problem with that theory is manifold, but one is the sectarian documents have a lot of congruency in what they're arguing. The same characters are referred to in documents coming out of Cave 4 and Cave 1. The teacher of righteousness, the instructor, the wicked priest, right? In many of the sectarian documents from different caves, you've got this congruency of thought. They're all congruent in the calendar they use, specifically that they're not using the calendar that the Jewish temple used. They're using this different 365-day solar calendar, which is the calendar used in Enoch and Jubilees. It's a different calendar that was used, right? They didn't like the solar lunar calendar. They didn't like dealing with the moon. They wanted just a solar calendar. Now, obviously, give it a couple hundred years, that calendar, belief in that calendar is going to die off because you're in the wrong month after a while, right? It's not right. But there's a congruency of thought, of vocabulary, of theology, if we can use that term, among sectarian scrolls from disparate caves, which makes me think that there was one community, a subset of a community that would have followed the Damascus document. Remember, the Damascus document is basically a call to covenant for Jews different than what's going on in Jerusalem. Okay? And this was probably a subset. This is John Collins at Yale. This is his theory, among others, that the Serach the community rule, these documents are a subset of a group that ascribed to the Damascus document, and that they reoccupied what had been a Hasmonean fortress. I am not the first one to propose a reoccupation model. Jean-Baptiste Humbert argued that it was I think he argued that it was a villa rustica that became a sectarian center. Others have said that it was a fortress that became a pottery facility. I argue that it was a fortress that became squatted, basically, occupied by a group of Jews ultimately responsible for some, not all, of the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's my theory.